Welcome to Chapter 5, Access Control in the Enterprise. So what are we going to look at? Our objectives today: design appropriate authentication solutions throughout the IT infrastructure. So first, let's take a look on what we're going to be doing. Our homework for the week. We have a couple different things. We have two assignments we're going to be looking at. The first is our discussion of the multi-factor authentication. I want you to spend some time at that. And how does multi-factor identification help us? And how does it keep us secure? These are some of the things we're going to look at. And then the other thing you're going to write is your assignment, Achieving Zero Trust. So you're going to take a look at that. And how do we make sure that what we're putting together makes sense? Not trusting any users or devices. So we have to make sure we have our policies in place and we have everything that we're looking for. So those are our two assignments for the week. So, key concepts: access control lists, the ACLs, access control modules, single factor and multi-factor authentication, wireless IEEE 802.11, and best practices for private and public sector authentication. So, what we're going to look at: as we know, access control, if we're just looking at one system, it's easy. But when we're looking at enterprise systems, our entire company, all the data, the files, the storage, the databases, who has access to these? And everyone's going to have different access. So because of this, everything becomes a little more complicated. We have to have systems in place that will help us prevent hackers, systems in place that will help us prevent users from not going where they need to be. And we have all our data and backed up storages and who has access to all this. So this is what we're going to be looking at this week. So what is an access control list or an access control entry? So the access control list allows us to create a list of, within the Windows data structure, allows us to create that system that allows, we put a list in who can see what data. So we have a list on who's approved, who's not approved. We don't have to worry about approving it each time. We put this on our list. This is what we're looking at. This is how we want to control who can see what data, when, and how. We can even control times if we wanted to. Usually we don't bother. And the same with the entries. We put all this in there, and usually there's going to, and we discussed this the other day, there's policies in place. Who has access to see this stuff? Who's going to be able to have access to view it? Who's going to have access to edit? And who's going to have access to create? Because we can have all these different levels within our organization, within our enterprise. So authentication factors of what we're looking at. Let's see, let's go back. Hang on a second. Chapter 5. I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. I skipped over something. I'm sorry. So we have the dysentery access control list. It contains access control entries that allow or deny subjects permissions to interact with everything. Then we have the systems access control list, which contains the access control entries allow systems administrators to get into the system. And again, at these levels, the discretionary, the access control list, the access control entries, everything can have different permissions, from read only to read, write, and create, or even no access. So this is where we can set up who can get to what. So it's really an important concept that we keep that in mind, that this is our controlling, and we want to make sure when we're putting this together that we have the right policies and procedures in place to prevent anyone who doesn't want it to have it. So it's usually a signature of the manager and possibly of the IT to keep everything up and board. So a couple things we want to look at also: discretionary access control is the policy that is defined by the owners group. object owner. So if we have the IT department is in charge of these files, it's everyone in that IT department can have access to that. And we have the rule-based control, which is the policy defined by the functions for the users within the organization, for instance, roles of human resources and finance. So here what we're saying is if I work in the finance department, I might even have a difference between accounts payable and accounts receivable. So accounts payable can see certain files, accounts receivable can see certain files. So this helps us to keep that differentiating between everyone. Mandatory access is policy defined by the system. Attribute-based access, policies and functions of the subject's characteristics. So a manager might have access to certain areas, but they'll have access to more than a user. So these are some of the different things that we wanted to look at. The other thing is the, let's see, that covers that. So why do we want all these in place? Some authentication factors. So that's what our discussion question is going to be on. So what types of authentication factors are there? There are multiple that we're going to look at. So basically, if you remember from the first week, usually authentication is something you know, something you have, or something you are. So something you know is a subject that you're aware of your knowledge, so a password. Something you have can be a token, and something, a characteristic of you can be your iris or fingerprints. So these are the things that we want to look at when we're putting together. So this allows us to protect our data with some level of security. And we want to make sure that we aren't fighting a couple different things. Let me just come back. So what are we looking at today? There's a couple different attacks that can occur. And so when we're creating passwords, we don't want to use basic words, as we've been talking about. Because if we use if we allow users to use just words, it's something called a dictionary attack. They just have a program that tries every word in the English language or whatever language to hack that password, to hack that thing. Then we have the brute force attack, using software code to run through various password schemes with numbers, symbols in it. This takes a lot longer, but it is effective when someone uses password 01. So they are effective for some of the other types of people who don't follow it directly. We also have an eavesdropping. They listen to our networks. This is, if you're in a high-rise building, well, you have where all your electrical throughout the whole building, an electrical closet. So if you're on the 5th floor, well, your wires have to go through the 4th floor sometimes to get up there. So someone can actually listen to you, put a sniffer on it, and get some information out of your thing. But as we've learned in Chapter 3, social engineering is one of the biggest things for giving up information that we need to look at. So we got to keep that in mind. And again, as we covered there, it's all about training. There are a couple other things that we can talk about that we're going to look at. Man in the middle attack, conversation is sometimes communicated. Phishing, happens more. I know every day when I open my email, I have to have at least 24 different phishing attacks from everything. My Target password is violated. My American Express has these extra charges on it. I'm getting a computer sent to me next week. And these are just things to send out that they send out because there's absolutely no cost to them. They have the server and they just send it out. So we got to be aware of this. Spear phishing is a little more pinpointing, and this happened to Barbara Corcoran a couple last year. Someone attacked her, sent her secretary an email looking like it came from a legit place with all the proper information on it, but it turned out to be stealing about $300,000 from her. I think she got most of it back. But this happens. This is spear phishing. They're not sending it to everyone. They're sending it to specific people. And smishing is through your SMS, because I know I am starting to see that more and more. I get spam on my phone all the time now. So again, these are some of the things that we have to be understand, and we have to train our people to understand it. We have to make sure we have our systems in place to prevent it. So if someone gets hacked, they're not going to have access to the entire system. Let's see. So what's single factor authentication, right? That's what we were just talking about. You log in one time, log in, username and password. Single, nice and simple. This is what most people have, but with everything going on in the world right now, this is becoming probably a little more hackable. So many companies that I'm working with are going to multi-factor. So it means I get an SMS on my phone with a password. They might call me. So two-factor authentication really helps us to prevent someone from us being hacked without that second factor, whether you get an email or something on that order. Now, one of the things that companies for really strong and sensitive data, maybe in the finance world, would be a three-factor. Includes all the same. For example, you're going to have a room badge to get in, a PIN number, and a retinal scan because of the room's restriction. So this is something for super critical. So there are a couple of things that we might want to think about. We usually don't get that far, usually up until this point. And I said two factors becoming the standard now, especially with everyone carrying their phones on them. You don't leave home without your phone. Well, you're going to be able to log in from wherever you are. You get the message. And actually, I set this up for my mother because of someone hacking into her account, her Amazon account, and buying a whole bunch of stuff, but we were able to catch it. So now there's a two-factor authentication. So whenever she wants to go on and buy something, she has to get the text message, and it allows her to be safe. So we're going to look at Kerberos authentication. So what is Kerberos authentication? It's a network security protocol that provides authentication and authorization services on the network. Communication on the unsecure network allows attackers to listen and steal a confidential thing. Kerberos uses cryptology in order for the client to prove the identity of the server. Once the identity is proven, the communication is encrypted, credentials obtained are used to verify the identity. And this. So it prevents plain text passwords from being sent over the network. It centralizes usernames and password protection, making them easy to maintain and manage. It removes the vulnerability associated with storing passwords on the local computer. Kerberos is based on three systems: Kerberos key, trusted key distribution system, Kerberos ticketed granted system, and authentication service. So again, it provides transparency for the user. Does not have to know. Excuse me. Does not have to know the Kerberos system exists. He or she only has to know the credentials. Security. The attacker should not be able to obtain users' credentials, and scalability. This allows it to be managed no matter the size of it. So how does this system work? It involves three basic steps: client authentication, client service authorization, and client service request. So it kind of works like this. The following is how it works. The user enters in the ID and password. The client performs a hash. We'll get more into that when we cover cryptology on the passwords created and the secret key. The client sends the information and the request with the password in it. And let's see. So the client receives the two messages. After decrypting the client session key, the client uses that. So you can kind of see how it kind of falls together. It's a two-way communication. So it allows it to have the information we have it. And when we talk more about cryptology, we'll get more into the hash and understanding. Symmetric key is another thing that we can look at for third-party authentication. And this Kerberos performs the authentication as a trusted third-party authentication service with a shared key or symmetric. When the client wants to obtain authentication credentials for the server that it does not have credentials, the exchange between the authentication server and the client is initiated. And we have the key distribution center, which is again a third party that allows us to have this available to us. Some of the weaknesses of it: a brute force attack can break into it, which we've talked about. Key storage: Kerberos tickets are cached on the user's system. Clocks must be synchronized to complete the authentication. So these are some of the downfalls of it. So let's take a look at network access. The network access, called NAC, network admission control, is the use of policies within the network infrastructure to limit access to resources until the system proves that they have compiled enough information. So, layer 2 techniques. Layer 2 of the open interconnected OSI model, which is for your NIC card, refers to the data link layer. The data link layer allows the communication over the wide area network, which allows you to get the information. We also have the wireless protocols that we're going to look at. And as you know, on the MAC address, every MAC address is unique, but it's layer 2 that we're going to be looking at. So the IEEE standard for 802 is 802.11 is the wireless. Now, when we're looking at wireless, and this is when, in previous years, this was where a lot of hackings occurred. Target was hacked this way over the wireless internet, and we're going to talk about that too. The layer 3 is the OSI model, is the network layer. So everything works in conjunction. There's 7 layers in that OSI model. And this helps us to do it. So the wireless LANs, IEEE has established a standard for wireless LANs that we use, which pretty much is used more widely today than ever. The access to get on this, we need to have the Wi-Fi protected that we need. We have to have our MAC address. We have the WEP, which is thing, and authorization. So these are some of the things that we look at. We're also going to look at single sign-on. Refers the scope of it. What is single sign-on? It's a method of access control that allows a user to log on to the system and gain access to resources within the network via initial logon. If the single sign-on was not implemented, the user would need to log in multiple times, multiple passwords for each different application. So single sign-on, if I log into my office in the morning, all my applications will open with the same single on. It's confirmed who I am, so it goes back and checks, and it allows it to open up all my applications, so I don't have to log into each application. Again, the whole purpose of this is it saves the employee time and effort. But we have to make sure that it's secure, because if someone gets your login and password, then they have access to all the applications you have. So there is a fine line between is single sign-on something we should use or not, and it depends on your company's policies and procedures. So we want to look at that. Some best practices that we want to look at. We want to make sure that we have enterprise organizations, that we have everything: discovery, identity, develop policies and procedures, placing appropriate access controls in place, and continuing monitoring. So a quick review. We learned and understood the significance of information within the enterprise helps the administrator grant proper access to those working within the infrastructure. Limiting access reduces risk of the enterprise and assisting in ensuring that data does not get in the wrong hands. So this is what we were looking at this week. So this helps us to provide a level of security, whether we're using single sign-on, whether we're using Wi-Fi, just helps prevent anything from going wrong. The whole idea is we want to protect all of our data, all of our applications, all the time. Thank you, and we'll talk to you next week. Welcome to Chapter 6, Mapping Business Challenges to Access Control Types. So what kind of business challenges could we have? Everything. So, for what were our learning objectives this week, design appropriate authentication solutions throughout an IT infrastructure, implement appropriate access controls and identity management techniques within it, some basic concepts, access control in relation to business challenges, access control strategies to solve business challenges, and access control systems design principles. So, what are we going to do this week? Well, you have Chapter 6 to read. That's your first assignment. Also, we want to look at, we're going to be looking at explain various access control types and business challenges and create that. So your learning material, you have your PowerPoints there, video of the PowerPoint and my lecture. This week we only have one assignment, and it's discussion privileged accounts and how are they going to take effect. Remember, they're due by Thursday, your initial response, and then you must reply to at least 2 classmates by Sunday night. So please make sure you get all that done. All right, so let's take a look. What are we looking at? This lesson is going to focus on, hang on a second. Focus on the concepts related to access controls and the relation to business challenges. You'll first address the types of business challenges that can be solved with access control systems. Then you'll describe the tools and techniques that can be helped apply. So, what are we looking at? Some business challenges, but we can think of them as also disaster recovery. We have to keep the system up and running at all times. That's basically what it comes down to, and that's what we're talking about today. Business continuity and disaster recovery. Keeping the organization operating efficient and all the essential functions functioning. If the systems aren't up, we can't work. Business continuity. Creating a business plan should be what-if scenarios. And I'm sure no one saw the pandemic coming. But what if we get hit by a hurricane? What if we get a power outage, a fire? All these things management should think about and figure out how we're going to be doing, prevent these from happening and prevent us from losing business. I know probably 5-7 years ago we had the hurricane come through. Our business office, we lost power for 10 days. We were lucky we had a generator because we were the headquarters for the U.S. operations. So even though our office only probably has about 200 people in it, the rest of the U.S. operations is about 3,000 people. So if we don't keep our system running, it's not just the office is down, all 3,000 people in the whole, we're centralized computer system, so everyone, 3,000 employees would not be able to do their job for 10 days. That is not all that efficient. So making sure we have a plan in place allows us. We did have problems with the generators. The generators only operated our room, our server room. It did not operate the other offices. It did not operate lights and heat. So our building still got really cold that day, that week. But we have to think about it. Management needs to think about it. What if we lose power? What if a hurricane hits? So these are the things that people have to think about. And we think about them up front. I guarantee you there's not tons of data centers down in Florida or along the East Coast. They're inland. They're away from hurricanes. Same token, Hurricane Alley. Probably not tons of data centers, unless they're small. But all the major companies are building them where where it's relatively safe, so that we have time to respond to these types of things. And if you read your book, the first example, it tells you the headquarters is located in Miami, highly susceptible to natural disasters such as hurricanes and floodings. So where did it put its headquarters? Did it put a headquarter in Miami? In the central of the U.S. Today's with high-speed internet, it doesn't need to be right next to it. It's quite a distance away. I know when I was at OmniPoint, we had our headquarters one in North Jersey and one in, if you want, central North Pennsylvania. Again, the purpose, that was our hot standby service center. So that we had one, it was drivable to get to both of them. They were probably about 200 miles apart. But they were far enough apart that if a hurricane hit the coast of New Jersey, chances of it hitting Pennsylvania at the same time were slim. And vice versa. Anything coming from the west probably would hit that and not ours. So these are the things that companies need to plan about. Where do we put our service centers to keep them running? So that's what we want to look at. So what is disaster recovery? Keeps our business running in case of a disaster. If there's a fire, do we have off-site backup for our tapes? Can we bring it up quickly? What is all this? And now one of the things you want to keep about also in mind is we used to test our backup systems. The first time we used it, we had a failure. We went to the tape did not work. There was a glitch in it. So after that incident, we started making sure we did data recovery every couple of months or a year to make sure that every tape we had in rotation would work on recovery. Because we got to make sure we got to have access to everything that's going on. And that's usually the chief operating officer, the CEO of the company, that's going to also help with that, making sure we have everything in place. So what are we looking at? How do we maintain a competitive advantage? And this is short. So maintain a competitive advantage. We need to make sure we have our systems up in place, that we have the technology we need, physical security, administration, and these are what we want to look at. For risk, we know we live in a world where there's risk in everything. Well, if there's risk in everything, we have to determine how much risk are we willing to accept. What is our risk mitigation? What is our risk avoidance? So our risk avoidance is choosing to avoid activities that carry some elements of risk. For one thing, you might want to go on vacation during a war, into a war zone. You might not want to go on vacation during hurricane season down to the Bahamas or something on that order. You know it's a possibility that you can get canceled or whatever. Having a snowstorm, going on a ski vacation in the winter. These are some of the things. And now from a company point of view, where do we build our information? Do we have a web-based, a cloud-based system? Or is it going to be centralized or decentralized if we're housing everything? These are all the things we want to keep in mind to make sure we're choosing what we want. Once we know what our risk is, we can have a risk assessment. Accepting the risk and doing what you need to do anyway. So we know there's risk involved, and the perfect example is used in the book. A fireman, he knows there's risk to go into a burning building, but that's his job. He knows the risk, he takes precautions. The same with a police officer. We know there's risks doing business on the internet, but we have to do business on the internet, especially with the pandemic. So what does that mean? We accept the risk, but we're going to put systems in place to help us prevent it. Risk transference shifts the negative consequences of the risk from one organization to another. So if we're going to have the insurance, right? We have insurance policies. And today we just saw the pipeline get hit. Well, the whole Northeast was low on oil because they got hacked. They had to pay $5 million to the hackers to get control of their systems back. Well, hopefully they had insurance to help them pay that to make sure that everything went smoothly. So these are some of the different things we want. Then we have risk mitigation. The strategy combines attempts to minimize the probability of the consequences. So I guarantee you that the Colonial Pipeline is going to have much better security systems in place to prevent this from happening again. But there's risks in everything that we do. We cannot prevent it. This is doing business on the internet today, and it's what we have to take in mind every time we go out on the internet, every time an employee goes out on the internet, every time an employee goes and opens an email. There's risk. So we need to make sure we have systems in place that prevent that from happening to us, to prevent worms and viruses getting into our systems. So threats and threat mitigation. Any organization faces the types of threat in the IT infrastructure. The goal is to access it and mitigate it as much as possible. Confidentiality ensures that private, sensitive information is not disclosed. Integrity ensures the data has not been modified. And availability ensures the information is available when the people need it. See, this is what a good access control system does for us. It helps us keep everything when we need it, keeps out the intruders. And we have vulnerabilities. So what are some vulnerabilities and weaknesses? The systems can be exploited. Each system has vulnerabilities. These are part of the coding. This is why we test it and we make sure that we're good. But the operating system has vulnerabilities in it, right? Operation can be vulnerable to a variety of threats, including viruses and malware. Applications can introduce vulnerabilities into the system through design flaws in applications itself that bugs to the program. Users are probably the biggest one, as we talked about already, vulnerable to social engineering, insecure password practices. Training and policies help us prevent that. So these are some of the things we want to do. So what are some of the areas we want to look at? Solving business challenges with access strategies. Users, they are generally the individuals who need access to the resources. So we need to help make sure they have it. Applications. Applications often need access to the operating system to run correctly, reading and writing from files and hard drives, and we have to make sure we have that. Network devices. A proxy on one network will often request one from another. So these are some of the things that we need to do. So our infrastructure, we should make sure we have the proper rights for everything. Groups and roles, we talked about that 2 weeks ago. Employees with access to system data. We talked about the role-based accessing, who has what, and that's another thing we need to keep in mind. Even non-essential data should be stored under some level of access control. For example, the company's newsletter shouldn't be open to the world. It should be open only to the employees that need to see it, and third parties through an intranet. And who needs the access to these? Who needs access to what? Like I said, we have policies and procedures in place. We talked about that last week on how all this comes together. So we want to make sure that if in the finance area, if we have an accounting group for accounts payable and accounts receivable, that the two do not have the same access to each other's files. We keep them separate. If you're in an accounts receivable department, you can only see accounts receivable. If you're accounts payable, you're only accounts payable. You don't want to be able to have people cross-reference, especially those two departments. Now, the manager would have access to both as long as the manager oversaw both. If you had two different managers, each manager, again, would only have access to the ones that they would need. And this helps prevent cross-contamination and anybody getting into any kinds of trouble. And that's the purpose of the groups and roles. Who has access to from third party? You know, if we're working on a project, we might have to hire a third party programmer to come in. What access do they have? As a general, they should have the minimal access that we can give them and able to function through the job. But sometimes they're going to need higher levels, such as to databases and higher levels, in order to do the area that they need. Anyone with access to sensitive information, sensitive data, should make sure that we have gone through the proper procedures, that we have regulatory compliance, that we have the privacy issues stationed out, that nothing's going to be questioned, and we have all the proper paperwork from the managers and upper managers if needed. So, technical strategies to keep in mind as we're going through. Discretionary access control. DAC is the access control system where rights are assigned by the owner of the resource. MAC, or mandatory access control, is the access control system where rights are assigned by the central authority. Role-based access control is the systems where are assigned by based users. And automated access control, all accounts should be reviewed periodically to ensure that they still need access to that data. The other thing we want to keep in mind is separation of privileges. Is designed to ensure that if attackers compromise their systems, that they will only have access to limited data. They're not going to have access to everything. So sometimes it can compartmentalize, making sure that they have it, using least privileges. So someone, as you know, the perfect example, accounts payable, accounts receivable, they only have access to one. They don't have the upper levels where they can see everything. So these are some of the things that we want to look at. Common rules, administration. Administrators should not have root rights. That should be kept as a separate password. And we should never log in as administrator unless we're doing administrator's work in case anything is compromised. That should be part of the rules. We also should only have a need to know. Users should only have information that they need to know about, nothing higher. Input-output controls are dedicated users' ability to interact with devices. Input controls dedicate how they're going to output controls. Access control. Least privileges we talked about. Least common mechanism. These are the areas that we were just discussing. The summary, all access control systems are about solving problems and meeting business needs. In order to do this effectively, you need to be familiar with the variety of access control types and understand how to map those types to various business challenges. Understanding how access control systems used in the railroad could be integrated with the information that we need. So that was it for chapter 6. Have a wonderful day.